afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar, Arms Control Then and Now. My name is Flavia Gasbarri. I am a lecturer at the War Studies Department at King's College London and a member of the KCL Center for Grand Strategy. And today I have the great pleasure to chair this talk, which is part of the Institute for Historical Research Partnership Seminar Series called Applied History and Contemporary Geopolitics. This seminar series is convened by the Engelsberg Applied History Programme, the Center for Grand Strategy at King's College London, the Center for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge, and the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office historians. So today, this is the fourth talk of this series, and today is all about arms control. And I'm very happy to now introduce to the public our speakers for today. First of all, Professor John Maurer, who is a professor of strategy and security studies at the School of Advanced Air and Space Studies at Air University. And he's also a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He studies nuclear strategy, arms control, and the history of American foreign relations. His work has been published in several journals and news outlets, including Diplomatic History, Texas National Security Review, War on the Rocks, Real Clear Defense. His book, Competitive Arms Control, is forthcoming with Yale University Press. And then we have our discussant, Dr. James Cameron, who is a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Political Science at the University of Oslo, where he is a member of the Oslo Nuclear Project. He has previously been a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of War Studies at King's College London, at Stanford University and Yale University. His research focuses on the history of arms control from the 19th century to the present day, and the lessons it holds for contemporary policy. He's the author of the book, The Double Game, The Demise of America's First Missile Defense System and the Rise of Strategic Arms Limitation, which was published with Oxford University Press in 2017. So welcome, thank you very much for being here. So just a few information before we start the talk. First of all, this talk is recorded. And I invite the public to post the questions and comments about the talk on the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. I think John will talk for approximately 20 minutes, and then, of course, James will respond with his comments and questions. Okay, thank you very much. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Flavia, and thanks again to KCL, Engelsberg Applied History, the Center for Geopolitics, for hosting this seminar. I'm going to share some slides real quick to accompany my remarks. Apparently, sharing of slides has been disabled. So give me 1 second here to see if we can sort that out. Here we are. Excellent. Share. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
As Flavia said, I'll be speaking today, the topic arms control then and now. Arms control is a topic that has had some very transformative historical work done on it in recent years, especially the Cold War period of arms control, as we've had more and more access to sort of archives from the Cold War. Which gives us a new opportunity, I think, to revisit some of those older historical debates or the historical policies with some important implications for contemporary arms control policy, given the challenges that the arms control regime has faced in recent years. So today, I'd like to review a little bit of the emerging historical literature on arms control in the Cold War. Show how it's transforming our understanding of what occurred during the Cold War, the purpose of arms control, especially during the Cold War, and then turn to some of the policy implications for contemporary arms control policy, the United States and its security partners especially. So I'm going to begin with arms control then and now. Arms control in the Cold War has come down to us with a very powerful myth, sort of very powerful story and narrative about how arms control played out in the second half of the Cold War. And I call this the cooperative myth of arms control. And to get into that, I'm going to begin in Moscow in May 1972. That month, President Richard Nixon from the United States and Leonid Brezhnev, the leader of the Soviet Union, sat to sign the Anti-Ballistic Missile, or ABM, Treaty, which was the first major agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union to place limits on their strategic nuclear forces. It was the outcome of the first round of the Strategic Arms Limitation talks. And the purpose of this agreement at the time was, people thought, fairly widely understood. I mean, you could go to the preamble of the treaty itself, and the superpowers laid out what the purpose of this treaty was. You know, the United States of America and the Soviet Union, proceeding from the premise that nuclear war would have devastating consequences for all mankind, considering effective measures to limit anti-ballistic missile systems would be a substantial factor in curbing the arms race, declaring their intention to achieve at the earliest possible date the cessation of the nuclear arms race, take effective measures towards the reduction in strategic arms, desiring to contribute to the relaxation of international tension and the strengthening of trust between states. This is a very cooperative rhetoric, right? The superpowers were setting aside their previous differences to build a new world, a better world that would be premised on cooperation rather than nuclear competition. And that message was reinforced when the agreements were signed and went into force that October. Richard Nixon remarked, "The signing of these documents today raises the hopes of all the people of the world for a world of peace, a world in which peoples with different governments and different philosophies could live in peace together." So in this interpretation that comes down to us, the strategic arms limitation talks, arms control in the Cold War more generally, serves as a hinge in which the United States and the Soviet Union moved from a period of intense competition to a period of tepid but growing cooperation in nuclear affairs. And the purpose of that cooperation, we're told, was to stabilize deterrence, to establish mutual assured destruction between the superpowers. This was the commentary at the time. Here we can see the New York Times from May 27th, 1972. The US and the Soviet Union signed the arms accords to limit the growth of atomic arsenals. And the interpretation that we have here by Max Frankel of the New York Times is that the purpose of these agreements is to freeze the balance of terrifying weapons and to make sure terror works by preventing any effective defense against them. So the United States and the Soviet Union, by forswearing any defense against nuclear attack, would establish a very stable deterrent relationship between the two countries that would allow them to move forward more cooperatively in the future without having to race for nuclear arms. And it's understandable that the New York Times, that would be the sort of interpretation, given the rhetoric that we heard from Richard Nixon, but also given the sort of predominant theories of arms control that came out of the Cold War in this period. You know, here we see the foremost theorist of arms control in the Cold War, Thomas Schelling, writing that the purpose of arms control is in fact to promote cooperation by bolstering this concept of assured destruction, mutual assured destruction. He says, whatever reduces the ability of weapons to achieve advantage by going quickly may reduce the likelihood of war. One is to alter the character of the weapons themselves, especially their vulnerability to each other. So what Schelling is saying is that by forswearing defense, by forswearing our ability to attack or destroy the other side's weapons, arms control will contribute to cooperation and peace. And in that cooperative account of arms control, the initial SALT agreements, the ABM agreement in 1972, was the genesis of a long-running strategic arms control policy that led to, amongst other things, the Vladivostok Agreement of 1974, the SALT II Agreement of 1979, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, or INF Treaty of 1987, and finally the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty of 1991. And this process of arms control, the construction of this arms control regime over time, stabilized mutual assured destruction, allowed the superpowers to achieve a more cooperative relationship, and ultimately contributed to the peaceful conclusion of the Cold War with the collapse of Soviet power in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. So that's it. This is the sort of cooperative myth of arms control that has come down to us. And like all good myths, it has important elements, it contains important elements of truth about this process. The superpowers did negotiate and build this arms control framework through the second half of the Cold War. And building cooperation between them was an important motive for many of the people who participated in these talks. But it wasn't the only motive, or even the predominant motive in many cases, for people who were leading these sort of arms control discussions. And that's where this emerging historical literature of the last decade, last several years, comes into play. Because if the purpose of arms control was to promote cooperation, was to end the nuclear arms race and allow the superpowers to move into this cooperative framework, why did we see a continued arms race between the superpowers through the second half of the Cold War? All of the arms control agreements that I just described from the early 1970s through the early 1990s occurred against the backdrop of continued nuclear competition, continued nuclear rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. As a number of scholars have recently pointed out, Francis Gavin, Keir Lieber, Darrell Press, Brendan Green, there's a significant emerging body of literature on this, that arms control does not in fact end the arms race between the superpowers. The arms race continues all the way to the end of the Cold War. And the arms race continues in sort of, not just continues, but continues in sort of new and varied ways. You know, we see here a picture of a new type of weapon that emerges during this period of arms control. A type of missile known as MIRV, a weapon that has multiple warheads on a single missile. Allows you to hit many targets with a single missile, and not just hit them, but hit them with much greater accuracy. So again, if this arms race is going on through the second half of the Cold War, if the superpowers are still building new weapons, new types of weapons, increasingly lethal and accurate weapons, that leads us to a sort of interesting puzzle in the second half of the Cold War, which is, why was there arms control at all? If the purpose of these agreements was to limit the arms race, and American leaders were largely uninterested in ending the arms race, then why did they negotiate arms control agreements in the first place? The sort of traditional account of this is that there were sort of good Americans and bad Americans, and the good Americans favored cooperative arms control, and the bad Americans favored arms racing. And as they sort of went in and out of power, you know, the Carter administration favors arms control, the first term of the Reagan administration favors arms racing, the second term of the Reagan administration favors arms control. But in fact, this American pursuit of the arms race, pursuit of new weapons, is a fairly constant thread throughout all of the administrations from the mid-1970s onwards. So why do they also pursue arms control negotiations at the same time as pursuing the arms race? As an entree into that, I want to share with you a conversation between President Richard Nixon and some of his chief national security advisors in August 1971. This conversation was captured on the Nixon tapes. It occurs while the United States is negotiating the first round of arms limitation talks with the Soviet Union. President Nixon says to his advisors, "Wouldn't you say that MIRV is almost indispensable, these new missiles with multiple warheads? MIRV is almost indispensable in view of the fact that they, the Soviets, have so much throw weight. The advantage that we have has got to be maintained by the MIRVing of the system." His Deputy Secretary of Defense, David Packard, says, "Mr. President, let me suggest that some agreement to reduce the total number of delivery vehicles so they're roughly equal. The MIRV is the one significant advantage that we have." And his Secretary of Defense, Melvin Laird, says, "There's a lot more we can do with Minuteman, the missile, the MIRV missile, at the site as far as getting it even more accurate," again, MIRVed accurate missiles. "And we can do it at a very small price because we have the technological capability that far outstrips the Soviet Union." To which Nixon replies, "So just talking about any kind of SALT agreement, we go gung-ho on the accuracy side because it's unlimited." And his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, says, "That's right. Accuracy is absolutely essential." So what we hear emerging in this conversation is a very different conception of arms control than the one that comes down to us in this sort of cooperative account, right? Nixon and his advisors behind closed doors, behind this veil of secrecy, were not trying to find ways to end the arms race with the Soviet Union. Instead, they were trying to find ways to shape the arms race with the Soviet Union, to find ways to use arms control as a tool to advance American competitive advantage, to allow the United States to prevail in the arms race over and against the Soviets. And this approach, this sort of approach to shaping the arms race through negotiation to one's own advantage, I call competitive arms control. It emerges from my own work, but also the work of other people, Brendan Green, and actually James here as well has written on this a bit. This idea that one of the major purposes of this negotiation process was to shape the arms race in ways that would advantage American power. And what we see emerging from that conversation between Nixon and his advisors is that their approach to arms control is in many ways an adjunct to their larger competitive strategy. Strategy in the second half of the Cold War is called the offset strategy. What American leaders want to do in this period, across administrations from Nixon to Reagan, is that they want to race the Soviets not in the number of weapons or the number of missiles. They want to race in the quality of missiles, not who can build the most, but who can build the best weapons. They want to shift from sort of competition for large numbers to this emerging nexus of different technologies, much of it enabled by the digital computing, revolution in digital computing in the second half of the Cold War. New airframes, new stealth capabilities, new sorts of highly accurate weapons driven by gyroscopes, space capabilities and navigation that will allow for tremendously increased accuracy of weapons. And arms control plays an important supporting role in this competitive offset strategy, which is, as we heard Nixon and his advisors saying, you want to limit this and you don't want to limit this. If you limit the areas that the Soviets are strong and you don't limit the areas that the United States is strong, you can in some ways push the Soviets to compete, to race you in your area of advantage. And by doing so, you can potentially stay ahead of the Soviets, potentially prevail in the arms race in the second half of the Cold War. And this is their approach. It leads me to sort of posit that what we see in the second half of the Cold War, rather than sort of a progressing arms control regime of sort of interlocking agreements moving towards a greater cooperative framework, is instead a sort of cyclical approach to arms control. Competition in different sorts of weapons technologies pushes the superpowers into negotiation. And the outcomes of those negotiations then shape later rounds of competition over time. And we see this throughout the second half of the Cold War. We see that in the 1960s, the competition for the number who could build the most ballistic missiles leads to the initial strategic arms limitation talks to limit the number of ballistic missiles. Those talks then shape the second round of the arms race, which is primarily at that point a race for warheads, as we heard, sort of multiple warhead systems, who can produce and put the most warheads on their missiles. The race for number of warheads then is the primary consideration in the Vladivostok Agreement, which places some notional sort of provisional limits on those. And once those are limited, the superpowers move instead into competing in aircraft, modernizing their bombers and producing new types of cruise missiles for those bombers. The modernization of bomber systems is then a major concern in the SALT II talks, which place some limits, but on certain types of those technologies. That then too shifts competition from the strategic realm into new theater missiles. The Soviets deploy updated shorter range nuclear weapons in Europe, and the United States and NATO follow suit. That race for theater weapons then shapes the limitation of those weapons in the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. And then that emphasis on sort of modernization and replacement of systems shapes the race for strategic missile replacement in the 1980s that also leads to the START I talks. So again, arms control takes place in the second half of the Cold War in this iterative process. Competition drives rounds of negotiation, which are intended not really to end competition, but rather to shape competition, to push it in different directions. That would hopefully be to, over time, American leaders hoped, to American advantage. And as a result, we can see that that sort of cycle goes on: competition, negotiation, competition, negotiation. And over time, that cycle of arms control does build an arms control regime. It does build a whole series of interlocking agreements. And one of the important legacies of those agreements is the ability to sort of place guardrails on superpower competition, push the arms race in one way or another, and help contribute to the peaceful end of the Cold War. But with the advantage of hindsight and a sort of renewed understanding of American motives in this period, I would argue that one of the more enduring legacies of the Cold War arms control regime is actually the emergence of the current regime of precision strike technology, the revolution in military affairs that has become the hallmark of American Western militaries today. This combination of computers, networks, advanced sensors, extremely accurate weapons, is one of the most important legacies of this arms control process, as the United States, American leaders sought to push competition towards this bundle of technologies. So if that's the new literature, if that's the sort of emerging idea about what the Cold War arms race was about, what does that mean for today? What would it mean if arms control was a competitive process? And in some ways, I think it's an especially apropos time to be revisiting this question, to be thinking about what are the motives for great powers when they engage in arms control, because over the last several years, we have seen a remarkable deconstruction of the remains of that Cold War arms control regime that persisted for several decades after the Cold War's end. But after Russian cheating on the INF Treaty, the United States decided to pull out of that treaty. The US has also pulled out of the Open Skies Treaty, announced just last week that it wouldn't be trying to re-enter that agreement. New START, the Biden administration decided to extend the New START Treaty just a couple months ago. Although that was a close run thing. If Donald Trump had won back in November, there's good reason to believe that New START would not have been extended. And even with that agreement extended, New START is now set to expire in 2026. And if it expires without replacement, it will be the first time since 1972 that the US and Russian nuclear arsenals have had no arms control limitation on them. So it's a major question for us as to what would come next. What is next for arms control? Why are these agreements falling apart as they are? And one answer that people point to, a sort of commonly held answer, is that we're seeing a major shift in the international system in recent years. This so-called return to great power rivalry or great power competition, as we prefer, I suppose, to call it in the Air Force, GPC. And that the return to great power rivalry, the increasing tension, especially between the United States on the one hand and China and Russia on the other, is creating a challenging environment for arms control agreements. And it shouldn't be too surprising when we think about it that an arms control process that was designed to shape great power competition, great power arms racing in a world that looked like this, a sort of bipolar world of US-Soviet competition. That regime would struggle in attempting to regulate great power competition in a world that looks like this, a sort of multipolar world of many great powers competing for advantage. And so I do think that we stand a decent chance in the coming years of finding ourselves in a position very similar to the position that American and Soviet leaders found themselves in the mid-1960s, which is to say that we will have no arms control regime. And the question will be, how will we build a new one from the ground up to regulate our new world, to regulate and shape our new competition? And to that end, I'd suggest two sort of very broad policy approaches for thinking about where we should go on arms control. The first is that if we take seriously this idea that there's an arms control cycle, that we move through phases of competition and negotiation, we should recognize that this is the phase we are now in. The United States, and to a certain extent security partners, are engaged in a renewed round of competition with rivals in China and Russia especially. And that if we want to get back to the phase of negotiation, if we want to build a new arms control regime for our new circumstances, the first thing we might have to do is lean into competition to get there. And that would probably involve not only nuclear modernization, sort of modernizing some legacy systems, but also thinking about how we would compete, how we would develop all sorts of systems, all sorts of the systems that we might want to limit in the future. Robotics, autonomy, hypersonics, space capabilities. If we want to limit these sorts of capabilities, we might, indeed, we should first be leaning into competing in them. That is the way forward. And the second point is to think about more seriously about arms control's place in a multipolar system. A number of our sort of Cold War bipolar examples are difficult to bring over to this. And so I think it's especially fruitful too for us to be revisiting not just the Cold War, but previous instances of multipolar competition. So we could go back to the interwar period, especially the three-way competition for naval mastery between the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Empire of Japan. And think about the sort of arms control agreements that govern that system. for good or for ill, in the interwar period. Especially interesting, I think, is the 1922, the Washington Naval Treaty. This treaty was especially famous for establishing a ratio of forces between the three major naval powers. For every 5 tons of battleships that the United States and the United Kingdom received, the Japanese received only 3, the 5 to 5 to 3 ratio. And the Japanese accepted this ratio in large part because when you look at the record of negotiation, the United States and the United Kingdom ganged up on the Japanese during the talks. They sort of compelled the Japanese to accept this ratio by threatening them with the failure of the talks and the fact that Japan would then face an unregulated arms race with both the United States and the United Kingdom at the same time. And that, I think, has some implications for contemporary arms control policy too, as we think about what a future arms control regime in a multipolar world might look like, which is that in these sorts of arms limitation talks, arms control talks, you can have emerging dynamics that come out of different powers ganging up on other powers or teaming up to sort of oppose powers in the talks. So for example, today there's a big push in the United States, especially to try to include China in any future arms control talk, to have a sort of a three-way arms control dialogue between the United States, China, and Russia. And I have to say, I worry about where that sort of conversation might go based on the interwar example, because I think that you could create a dynamic in pursuing that sort of negotiation in which China and Russia are able to team up and compel the United States into some sort of arms control arrangement that might not be beneficial for American or Allied security. I think we would do better to think in terms of how to broaden arms control dialogue even further. In what ways the United States and its security partners could cooperate to advance our common security interests through negotiation. And in doing so, perhaps create new opportunities for arms control bargains that might otherwise be difficult to achieve in a sort of one-on-one dialogue. So leaning into competition, staying close to our security partners, producing common negotiating positions moving forward vis-a-vis rivals. I think this is where we are, and I think this is what we need to do if we want to rebuild an arms control regime for the 21st century. So on that note, I'll say thank you all for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, John. That was extremely interesting. We have already questions coming from the public, but first, of course, we want to hear from our discussion. James, please, the floor is yours. James? I think there might be some technical problem. James, can you hear me? Oh, it's frozen. Okay, let's wait if we can. Okay, let's wait for just a few seconds. We'll try to bring James back. Sorry about that. Let's see. Okay, James, I see you moving. Hi. So, okay.
Sorry,
so
so
you're back?
I'm here, yeah. Sorry about that.
No problem.
No, I'm back. Sorry.
Floor is yours.
Yeah. The Wi-Fi here is never failed before, and then it chooses just this moment to go on the blink. So apologies for that. So thanks very much indeed to the Centre for Geopolitics at Cambridge and to KCL Grand Strategy for the invitation to speak here. And it is really a pleasure because I'm a great admirer of John's work, have been for a long time. And that means I have to start by saying that I basically completely agree with the central premise of John's research, which is that the competitive side of arms control has not received the attention it has deserved in previous historical scholarship. And I really look forward to his forthcoming book on SALT 1. I think it's going to be a landmark and be a real contribution. So it's a real pleasure to be able to comment on the sort of the big picture here today. I think he's also correct that this competitive emphasis will continue to characterize US arms control policy and also will contribute to this broader disintegration of the Cold War legacy arms control agreements that we see happening. Maybe, as John says, foreclosing a new US-Russia strategic arms control agreement along the lines of New START, right? New START may be the last such agreement that we see. However, I perhaps am not so optimistic as John regarding the consequences of this transition away from arms control towards a period of unvarnished competition, right? So what you see, as John says, in the Cold War is this sort of competition, but with a gloss on it, a nice gloss that makes it somewhat less dangerous, perhaps. But really, what I think we're going to see, as John says, is a transition to a less varnished competitive atmosphere. Why am I less optimistic about this? Well, I think first of all because contemporaries at the time were quite pessimistic regarding the future of the competition, right? So I suppose I differ from John slightly in the way in which the Nixon administration saw the technological competition and how it was going to play out. Secondly, there's this intervening period in the late 70s, early 80s, when it seems as though things aren't really working out, that the strategy isn't really the way the United States wants to, and there doesn't seem to be a clear perspective. So the question is, why do we see this sudden reevaluation at the end of the Cold War? Well, I say it's because of Mikhail Gorbachev primarily, right? Which really allows John's cycle to turn in the way that he showed in those really compelling graphics. So firstly, on Nixon and the importance of technology, yes, they did see it as a key element of US strength. Resisted attempts by arms control disarmament agencies, State Department to limit systems like MERV, which John talked about. But I think we have to remember that they saw this as the least bad option, right? What they wanted, what Nixon wanted, or ideally, was the clear quantitative superiority that the United States had enjoyed in delivery vehicles in the early part of the Cold War, and so they saw leads in less tangible aspects of the arms race, like, for example, first of all, numbers of warheads, and then warhead capability, as distinctly second best, because they weren't so tangible, they weren't so clearly measurable as a sort of clear number, a clear numerical superiority. And Nixon, was skeptical. He's on record, as you know, John knows as well as I do. Nixon said a lot of stuff on the tapes, but he questioned the viability of the US nuclear umbrella for NATO under these conditions. He doubted American public support for extended deterrence that sort of essentially placed New York at risk to protect Bonn and other such far-flung places. So the lesson for history there for me is that, well, policymakers can go down this competitive path. Shouldn't see it as a sort of as a way towards a comfortable superiority. They will still worry about the credibility of US extended deterrent security commitments a lot, and that pessimism will be justified because, as I said, the technology left out of the SALT I agreements, I think, didn't lead the United States perhaps to judge itself as far ahead in the arms race as perhaps it seems in hindsight, right? And particularly with regard to MERV, right? So yes, the United States was ahead in 1972. Yes, continued to enjoy a lead for a number of years after that, but the Soviets tested MERV fairly quickly after the SALT Accords in 1973. And by the late 1970s and the early 1980s, the predominant conversation in the United States was really about Minuteman vulnerability, which was this idea that the Soviet Union could execute a perfect first strike against the US land-based missile force, right? And this was the predominant conversation in public, which makes me wonder how credible the United States really believed its technical lead to be, right? So yes, there was this momentary advantage with MERV, but by the late 70s and early 80s, that was turning, into a sort of Soviet equality, if not Soviet advantage. And then this sort of leads into the sense that by the early 1980s, both US arms control policy and US nuclear strategy in general was kind of falling into a dead end, right? There was unyielding Soviet resistance to this competitive strategy. There was a little on the military technical side that would really get the United States out of this in some kind of meaningful damage limitation posture. And so then that makes me wonder, well, why does this strategy, as John said, look so effective in hindsight? And for me, it just comes down to Gorbachev, right? The Gorbachev completely changes the game when it comes to these questions, right? He accepts things, competitive US positions on arms control that were just completely infeasible before, right? Zero option on intermediate range nuclear forces, on-site inspection, deep reductions in Soviet offensive missile forces, including Threeway. These kind of things were part of Gorbachev's radical agenda, which had something to do with, as John says, the need to relieve some of the burden of the arms race. But his rise, I think, was completely extraneous to this dynamic. And so Gorbachev was a real wild card, I think, in this story. And I think arguably when we look to the future, a real one-off, right? We shouldn't expect another Gorbachev to turn up and make a resurgence, a sort of reprise of this competitive strategy a success, right? So that's it. So I would say, yes, John is right. The competitive element is really, really important. But I think there's an amount of caution required as policymakers draw lessons from that history, right? Nixon and his successors did not see technological competition as a surefire route to success. They were skeptical of the US extended deterrent guarantee. By the early 1980s, it appeared the strategy wasn't working so well. And when change did occur, it was because of a political wildcard, essentially, Mikhail Gorbachev. So all of that means that while I think the leaning into competition that John describes may result in a new round of arms control, I think we also have to be equally prepared for just unrelenting and dangerous competition. So thank you very much. And I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, James, for your comments. John, do you want to spend maybe 1 minute to add something to what James, to respond to James, and then we move to the questions from the public?
Absolutely. I think James and I are basically on the same page in this regard. He makes very good points about the sort of historical record. My tendency is to sort of to lean into this competitive narrative of arms control as a sort of corrective to the way that arms control has often been perceived, but he's absolutely correct. The points that he makes, I think, though, in some ways strengthen the case for approaching arms control in this way today. Because I think that today we are in a position where, especially in the United States, American leaders have been used to having that sense of overwhelming superiority that perhaps the United States enjoyed in the earlier Cold War. And we are now, we are very much in the position, I would agree with James, that Nixon was in at that point, to say like, well, I would prefer to keep that. I would prefer to just be way better than everyone else in everything. But I can't get that today. So where is my edge? Where is my advantage? How comforting that will be is also a great question. I think the answer is probably not very comforting, certainly as we go through it. And to the point about Gorbachev, I think this is also a great point. I would, to this, I would say that in my sort of read of this situation, that the American competitive approach was necessary but not sufficient to produce the arms control agreements of the late 1980s, right? Absolutely, the competitive approach does not create those agreements automatically, right? Gorbachev is a key player in this regard. And as James says, sort of in many ways comes out of left field, unrelated to American policy initiatives, just sort of a sort of exogenous event that ends up paying dividends for this American strategy. The flip side, I think we could say, though, that if the United States had not pursued this sort of competitive approach, it's difficult to imagine Gorbachev making the concessions that he made, right? If the United States had not deployed Pershing II in Europe, it's difficult to imagine even Gorbachev accepting the zero option to dismantle Soviet SS-20s. So in that regard, I suppose I see this sort of leaning in to competition in a sort of dominant strategic sense, right? Which is that on the one hand, I think it gives us the best groundwork to exploit future political opportunities for arms control as they occur. And at the same time, if arms control does not occur, it puts us on the best competitive footing to live in a world in which competition is unregulated. But I agree with all of his points in that regard. So thanks.
Okay, thanks to both of you. I also have like 30 questions myself, but I would just now give the opportunity to the public to ask questions first. So we have a first question from Neyman. What role did no first use policies, Soviet, Chinese, Indian, play in arms control? And what about today?
On the US-Soviet front, which is most of what I study, the no first use policies I do not think had a major impact on the US-Soviet talks. When the Soviets sort of rolled out their no first use statement later in the Cold War, the United States saw it overwhelmingly as a Soviet propaganda initiative that was designed to sort of garner sympathy rather than a serious proposal. And I'll admit that that's sort of my read of many no first use policies today. I think that as a policy statement, it can have sort of an important impact on diplomacy, but as an actual limit on how nuclear weapons would be sort of used in a crisis, both for deterrent effect and also potentially for actual explosive use. I have to admit that I'm deeply skeptical that no first use policies do much of anything.
Okay, thank you very much. I would ask the following two questions together because to some extent they are related. So the first one from Rafaela asking how can we propose an arms limitation regime with so many private armies like the now Wagner Group, ex-Blackwater, of course. And then a question from ITFA asking, keeping bear in mind the emerging technologies, how do you see the efforts being made in arms control domain regarding these technologies? So, I mean, two different challenges that that we can see to a regime of arms control.
So on the question of private militaries, private military contractors, a couple points. The first is that it will depend on what sort of technologies that we want to limit in negotiation, right? To date, there are no private military groups that have nuclear weapons. So if the primary purpose of future talks is to limit nuclear weapons, then the private military groups can probably be largely unregulated in that regime. It gets a little dicier when we come to sort of emerging technologies, right? Autonomous weapons, robots, cyber capabilities, things that are increasingly available commercially, things that you could imagine on the margins private actors having access to. At that point, it's a great question and honestly not one that I've given a lot of thought to. My sort of gut reaction would be to say that most private military companies are still national companies. They are located in specific countries. And that therefore the limitation of those sorts of actors might have to be part of the negotiation between countries. So that if the United States is going to sign an agreement limiting autonomous weapons, part of the agreement would have to be that the US government also prevents American private actors from developing autonomous weapons. We had similar frameworks in the Cold War when it came to allies, right? The United States and the Soviet Union would have arms control agreements that also included promises not to transfer specific technologies to their allies. So that could be a potential model for sort of having third-party regulation within an agreement. And that leads into, as Flavia says, this sort of other question about emerging technologies and arms control more generally. This is another field where I think that going back to the earlier Cold War period helps us think about where we might go moving forward, because we are with some of these technologies, again, very much at a period where not only do we not have arms control agreements on them, but we don't have like a particularly good public understanding of what the technologies are, like what the key capabilities are, and how we would want to limit them or how we would verify limitations on them. I'd suggest in that regard that where we may need to go first is something along the lines of the role that the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists played in the early Cold War period, when nuclear weapons technology was very new, when there was still a great deal of uncertainty about how the technology even worked, what its capabilities were, how we could limit and verify limits on it. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists was a forum for world-renowned physicists to write articles that were aimed at a public audience. So not a peer-reviewed physics journal, but sort of pieces that were written to the public for public policy purposes. Played a very important role in establishing, sort of key issues like, yes, nuclear weapons produce radiation. No, nuclear weapons will not burn off the atmosphere and leave us with no oxygen left. Yes, nuclear testing in the atmosphere produces cancer in children. All of these sort of technical issues that people were working through on what nuclear weapons were, what they did, and how we might limit them. Obviously, there are a lot of good places today that are doing this sort of research, trying to push the ball forward on public engagement on this. To date, I have not seen anything quite so authoritative as the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists was in that period. So I think that for arms control on these technologies, in many ways, the first thing we need to do is build better public engagement and better public understanding with what the capabilities even are and what sorts of limitations that we would want to put on them.
Okay, thank you very much. James, of course, if you want to say something, interject into the conversation, feel free.
No, I will just second the point that John made about emerging tech. I mean, that's one of the things that I think it's important to have that conversation about emerging tech, but at the same time, we have to be cognizant of the fact that historically, as John has argued, and I think it's the historical record shows all the way back, actually far further, that the countries just aren't very keen on limiting emerging tech when it's emerging. But only when it becomes established technology are they willing to limit it. And we need to understand that when we talk about the prospects for limiting emerging tech.
All right, thank you very much, both. Next question from David. Based on your suggestion about the naval treaty, the question is, what if one of them, in your case, China or Russia, decide to walk away from the negotiation? The other issue is that, do you think in a multipolar world will be better to achieve the stability? Kenneth Waltz and other neorealists may disagree on this part.
Two great questions. So in terms of keeping people in the talks is vital. I have to admit that at this point, it seems to me that the bigger policy issue is just getting people to the table at all. And I think that the two questions are interrelated, right? You need to have a system set up in which you can incentivize people to come to arms control negotiations in the first place. And if that incentive holds true to bring them to negotiation, then hopefully the same incentives that brought them to negotiation will be strong enough to keep them in the negotiation and keep negotiation going. In that regard, because I am sort of so bullish on this competitive approach, this is again why I argue that what we need to lean into competition, because I think that the main incentive, the main leverage that we can produce to bring other parties to the negotiating table is to develop our own capabilities. In some ways, one could say that the main leverage is to coerce them into coming into arms control negotiation. And that level of sort of gaining leverage in talks, I think, is key. And as I said too, it's not only or even primarily a sort of vertical buildup of capabilities on the part of any one actor. For example, I think that if we wanted to have a future strategic dialogue with China on the limitation of fissile material production, how to limit the precursor capabilities that allow the production of nuclear arsenals, that one thing the United States should be considering in that regard is trying to bring other nuclear countries, but even nuclear latent countries like Japan, into that dialogue. Japan is a country that has no nuclear weapons, but a very large latent nuclear capability. So again, if that's the sort of dialogue that the United States wants to have with China, we should be considering how to broaden that dialogue in ways that would potentially incentivize Chinese participation. And I think we could potentially work through ways to do that for other emerging technologies as well. And then what was, I'm sorry, I lost the thread on the second part of the question. Sorry, Flavia, I can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. The second part of the question, do you think in a multipolar world would be better to achieve stability? Because, you know, the neo-realists may disagree on this.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess I'll punt on it. I think it depends on what we mean by stability. In terms of the sort of Schelling-esque sort of secure second strike forces type, you know, balance of stability, I think that theoretically a multipolar world, it's harder to establish that, just because if one side uses its capabilities against the other, then it's expended those capabilities and has left itself vulnerable to third parties. It becomes much harder to calculate one's capability against sort of potential rivals in a fluid multipolar system, because you never know who's going to gang up on you at any given point. In practice, though, I have to admit that I'm not actually terribly concerned about sort of Schelling-esque stability calculations. I think I'm much more of the opinion that countries get into conflicts with each other because they have political differences with each other, not because the sort of stability of their weapons or instability of their weapons leads them into conflict with each other. And in that regard, we are in a period of sort of transition, but I think that the emerging multipolar system is going to be decently well defined in terms of the fact that in Asia, it's basically going to be most countries against China. And in Europe and sort of Eurasia, it's going to be most countries against Russia. And the main sort of political determinant is going to be how closely the Chinese and Russians can stay to each other, given their potential common interests in opposing the United States and its security partners, but also their many political differences. So in that regard, whether that world will be more or less stable, I think is going to depend more on the sort of political equation and the ability of the United States and its partners to build common positions, and less on the sort of specifics of arms control negotiation and technology. I don't know if James has a different read on that.
Yes, please, James, if you want to add something.
He may have dropped out again.
It's frozen again. Okay. So I move in the meantime to the next question from Ian. Neither John nor James mentioned the SDI in the context of the progress made in the Reagan-Gorbachev era, I think. Did it influence Soviet thinking that it was better to lock in stability while preserving the ABM treaty rather than let it rip and risk the US deploying a successful ABM system?
Yeah, it's a really interesting case. In general, I find it difficult to find sources that I find especially compelling to understand the Soviet side of this story. You'll notice that the talk that I gave is very heavily weighted on the American side. What were the Americans trying to do? How were they driving the negotiation? And a large part of that, in my mind, is just driven by source access. We do have a number of important memoir accounts from sort of different levels of the Soviet government. We have some interesting sort of post-Cold War interview material with people sort of coming out of the Soviet government and military about what they were trying to do. But it's very difficult for me to assess how any of these sort of American initiatives actually played within the Soviet decision-making system. I think we can show a sort of correlation between the United States deploying new capabilities and the Soviets accepting arms control initiatives. I think we can show the converse correlation too, as James was saying, that as the Soviets deployed new weapons, the United States accepted new arms control initiatives. where SDI specifically fit in Soviet thinking. For Gorbachev, I think I would agree, and I'll let James speak for himself, but I think I would agree with James's earlier point that Gorbachev's decisions were driven less by the sort of military technical calculations and more by his sort of larger reform efforts. And to that end, I guess I see SDI as less important in driving Soviet arms control initiatives than American symmetrical competition in the specific capabilities that they were trying to limit at the time, which is strategic offensive forces. So SDI is probably less important than the US development of the MX missile and the Trident II missile in the late 1980s and early 1990s, which provide sort of important symmetrical capabilities to incentivize Soviet limitation of their equivalent systems, rather than the specific US pursuit of SDI, which was part and parcel of the United States competitive strategy, but at the end of the day, at that time, was a sort of fantasy. The technical capabilities that they were trying to pursue at that time in terms of missile defense simply would not have worked with especially the computing technology. I think that, is it Rebecca Slayton? Slayton has written a good book on this, on SDI. And so I think SDI was perhaps less, even though it was very high profile and covered at the time, was probably less influential than other types of weapons that the US was building at the time.
Thank you. James, I don't know if you have any comments on this.
Yeah, I don't think, I take the same view as John in the sense that, I think the Soviets perhaps were initially somewhat concerned by SDI, but on further inspection became less so. And, ultimately, there's a case for US insistence on SDI, slowed down arms control, certainly in the middle 80s, when it came to sort of breaking the ice initially with Gorbachev and Reykjavik. There was a real desire on Reagan's part to sort of to prevent any kind of limits on SDI, which Gorbachev just politically, I think, found unacceptable. So, but I don't believe that SDI really was a key part of this competitive strategy, or at least it didn't. The US may have seen it that way at the time. Certainly Reagan or others, Weinberger, others seen it that way, but it didn't. And from what I've seen and from what I've read of others, I don't see it. Another person, Sergei Redchenko, is writing a really good book with news Soviet sources, which I think will have a lot of arms control material in it. So that may be able to, I think that will shed some light on some of these questions that we've asked for a long time.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid we have time for just one last question, and I would combine two questions that I see here on the chat because they both concern France and Britain. So the first one from Yana asking, President Macron insists that the EU and European countries should agree about the architecture between themselves first and then being at the table together with the US and Russia of future INF negotiations first. Could you please comment on this and also on President Macron's proposal on extending nuclear deterrence? And then considering that nuclear weapons are the only great power elements the UK and France have outside the Sahel, at least, would they actually support arms control in any meaningful sense today? This is another question from Neyman. Thank you.
Yeah, great questions. So I will venture to produce some answers, even though I will preface them by saying that I'm a historian of American foreign relations in the Cold War. So I will no doubt reveal my ignorance on sort of contemporary European politics. But on the question of whether the EU would be sort of the negotiating partner, or whether it would be Britain and France and other countries, or NATO, I guess I'm relatively agnostic on that. I think that the key is going to be making sure that the United States and its partners are able to produce common negotiating positions. And that will be difficult, given that I would anticipate, given the way that previous such negotiations have gone, that the Russians would use any multilateral negotiation as a forum to try to divide the United States from its security partners and vice versa. In the same way, I should add that the United States will no doubt use any multilateral negotiation in an attempt to divide Russia from China, for example. I think this will be part of the game going forward. And that will open up some difficulties given the way that the United States has structured certain capabilities in partnership, not with the EU, but with NATO, and sometimes not even with NATO entirely, but with host nations for missile defenses like Romania and Poland. If missile defenses become an important part of those negotiations, then there's going to have to be some deconfliction between the United States and its security partners about who speaks for what in what context. But as to whether that should occur through the EU or through NATO or through a sort of network of bilateral or special group consultations, I don't have a particularly strong opinion one way or the other. And then on the question of limiting nuclear weapons, I think it will, yes, I would expect, again, based on my sort of shallow knowledge of this, that the United Kingdom and France would be reticent to surrender much, certainly in early rounds of nuclear negotiation. And there too, I think we see similar reticence on the part of countries like China that have relatively small nuclear arsenals, as far as we know, compared to those of the two big ones, the United States and Russia. And that's why, again, I sort of mentioned earlier that the next step in nuclear arms limitation at the multilateral level may have less to do with the specific number of weapons deployed and more to do with producing greater transparency and control over precursor elements for nuclear weapons, sort of fuel refining capabilities and stockpiling. And in that regard, I think that the United States should be able to produce the United States should be much closer to Britain and France on, for example, greater transparency surrounding nuclear precursor production than it is with China. Right now, the biggest problem we have with China is that their nuclear systems are so lacking in transparency that it's difficult to even say how many weapons they have or how much plutonium they have stockpiled. So if the first rounds of talks are just sort of producing greater transparency on those capabilities, that would seem to me to be the sort of thing that Britain and France could potentially participate in with the United States, perhaps India, Japan, other important nuclear latent countries, without having to compromise on sort of like dismantling their entire nuclear arsenal at the first step of negotiation. No, I don't think that would be feasible either for the United States partners or for potential adversaries like China who want to negotiate. But I do think there are some potential first steps that we could take together in that regard without too much difficulty.
Thank you, James. Any thoughts?
No, I think that's good. I would only say that, I don't think it's going to be the EU, because the EU doesn't have any nuclear weapons, and basically, in order to engage in arms control, you have to have arms to start with. And so it's not going to be the EU. It's going to be the UK and France.
Okay, thank you. I'm afraid the time at our disposal is over. I don't know if you have any final remarks.
Just thank you again for the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks to both of you. There was a very interesting and fascinating talks. Thanks to everybody from the public for attending the event and for all your very interesting questions and comments. As I said, this event has been recorded and it will be available, I guess, next week on YouTube. So thank you very much. Thanks to the speakers and thanks to the public. And see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.